This lesson is going to review the basic chemistry principles that you probably learned in chemistry class. So this is going to seem probably pretty simple, but I just want to make sure that everyone is up to speed regarding their understanding of basic chemistry. So you may be wondering, why is chemistry so important in biology? Well, as you probably are aware, all living things are made up of chemicals. We are just mainly a set of chemicals and chemical reactions that take place inside of our cells. So chemistry is absolutely vital to our understanding of biology. So if we look, all living things are pretty much made up of the same basic elements. Everything from a bacteria to a redwood tree to a human being are made up of the same basic elements. And the major ones, the ones that are found in greatest proportion in living things, are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So the 6 elements that we find most in living things. Now, all known elements, as you may recall, are found on the periodic table of elements, which is pretty set but does change from time to time. So they're organized on this big table, and they're organized a specific way, which I'm not going to necessarily go into too much. But we also know, of course, that atoms are composed of subatomic particles called protons, electrons, and neutrons. And I've indicated here that protons have a positive charge, electrons have a negative charge, and neutrons are neutral. They carry no charge. When we look at an atom, this is kind of a very basic model of what an atom might be organized, a way that an atom might be organized. But we have protons and neutrons located in the center of the atom in an area we call the nucleus, and they're held together in this clump. Each, we say that each has a molecular weight of 1 or an atomic weight of 1, and so they each contribute to the mass of the atom. And then the electrons are found whizzing around outside the nucleus somewhere, and they carry a negative charge. And because they're so small, we don't count their mass when we are looking at the mass of the atom as a whole. So when we look here at the periodic table of elements, I'm sure you've probably seen this before. I don't even think this is complete. I think it got cut off on the bottom. But anyhow, the atomic number that we see for each element located in the top left corner of each of these boxes, the atomic number is the number of protons. It turns out to be also the number of electrons, because in a balanced atom, in a stable atom, you have the same number of protons as electrons, because protons have a positive charge, electrons have a negative charge, and those charges balance out in a stable atom. If you look at the atomic mass, or the mass number of any element, which I guess is not shown on this particular periodic table, but on most periodic tables you will see the mass number given, and it is the number of protons and the number of neutrons combined, as I just mentioned a minute ago. As we said, the electrons have very little mass, and they're found outside the nucleus in an area that's, think of it as kind of fuzzy, because we're not sure exactly where the electron is at any given moment. You can think of it as like a cloud, or you can think of it as like an orbital, like planets orbiting the sun kind of thing. The electrons are like the planets orbiting the nucleus. Looking at the number of electrons in any element, it varies by element. So the number of protons, of course, determines what element that is. For instance, lithium has 3 protons in its atomic number 3, but lithium also, a normal stable atom of lithium, will have 3 electrons, and having those 3 electrons will actually determine how lithium behaves, the property of that element. So we can predict the property of elements based on the number of electrons, which is related to the number of protons, which is the atomic number. Now, as I said, the electrons are super important. They're zooming around at such high speed we don't really know where they are at any given time. We can say they're found in this cloud, or actually in concentric clouds around the nucleus. We also sometimes call them shells or orbitals, as I said. Those that are closest to the nucleus in this first orbital or shell contain less energy than those that are further away, and that becomes important later when we talk about bonding. But the first shell, the first electron shell or orbital, is lowest in energy. And last for this lesson, I'd like to talk a little bit about isotopes. I'm assuming you already know a little bit. Let's talk a little just to review. We talked about elements having protons, neutrons, and electrons, and the proton determines the element, such as I said, lithium being number 3 has 3 protons, and that determines that it is lithium. Different numbers of protons means different elements. But any given atom of lithium or nitrogen or carbon can have different numbers of neutrons, and it's still the same element. We call these isotopes of the elements. You could have a carbon, for instance, with 6 neutrons. You could have a carbon with 7 neutrons, and you can have a carbon with 8 neutrons. And all of these exist in nature. You'll see different isotopes or elements, atoms of various elements containing different numbers of neutrons naturally occurring that way. For instance, carbon, as I mentioned, it most commonly has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We call this carbon-12. It makes up 98.9% of the carbon we find in nature. A less common isotope has 8 neutrons, this one. We call this one carbon-14 because it has an atomic mass of 14, even though it still is carbon. It has 6 protons, so that makes it carbon. We call this carbon-14, and it's present in only 0.1% of the carbon in nature. Now, some of these, including carbon-14, are radioisotopes. They have numbers of neutrons that make them unstable. So having that particular number of neutrons with those protons makes it unstable, and they tend to decay. When they decay, they emit a little bit of gamma radiation, and we can measure that. So that's where you get the radioisotope. Because of that, we can use them to determine how old rocks are, or fossils, or, depending on the element, cultural artifacts. Carbon-14 is used to date artifacts because it decays at a higher rate. If we're looking at rocks and fossils, we have to use a different element. The other thing that we can do with isotopes is that they are used as tracers in medicine or in research, because we can use a particular isotope of an element to produce something that we're going to inject into someone, and we can see where it goes because it's emitting small amounts of gamma radiation. So isotopes are useful in medicine as well. That's it for this lesson, and more next week.